Okay, open to Genesis 37 if you've got a Bible handy. We're going to continue in our study of Genesis, which we've been a part of now for several weeks, actually months. We've come to the final section of Genesis, chapter 37 all the way to chapter 50. Continues the story of Jacob, which began in chapter 25. But now the attention is turned to his children, and particularly two of his children, Joseph and Judah. They're going to be the primary characters of the narrative from here on out. It's really a fascinating series of episodes that we have, starting with chapter 37, which is a chapter we're very familiar with. It's one of those stories that we hear from the time we were little kids in Bible study, in Bible classes. It begins a series of episodes that involves the sons of Jacob that are just quite interesting and almost seems like a modern story, the way the relationships are. And I think that's one of the ways that we're able to learn from these stories is the human relationships, the human aspect of all of this. But ultimately, these stories show us God, because God is working through this family, and as a result, working to bless the entire world. You and I share today, in the year 2020, from the blessing of God working through this family, and we'll see some of the indications of that as we go along in our study. Tonight, our focus is going to be on chapter 37, which begins this section and gets things set in motion that will unfold throughout all of these chapters, all the way to chapter 50, and really even beyond. This section of stories involving Jacob's family really sets up the rest of the Bible narrative from this point forward. And so it's a very vital part of our scripture. Before we actually get into the text, though, I want you to be thinking of some things as we work our way through these chapters. And it's going to take us a few weeks to do so. But I want you to keep these thoughts in mind, and I'll be reminding you of these thoughts as we go along. The first thing, though, is I want you to think of the way our Bible is written. So much of our Bible is in the form of narrative or story. And that's certainly the case with the book of Genesis. Genesis, for the most part, is one long narrative with lots of little episodes that fit into that longer narrative. That's the case with a lot of Hebrew narrative. Hebrew narrative is put together and arranged with different arcs in mind, A-R-K, or A-R-C rather, not A-R-K. A-R-C, an arc that connects stories together in one unfolding plot. We see that in novels, we see that in TV series that go over a season. There's an arc usually that connects those episodes together, especially if they're dramas. An arc that brings a central message or a central thought to everything that's told. And the Bible is written that way. The Bible narratives are arranged that way in an arc where there is a broad story, one large story that connects everything. That's the case with these chapters. Chapters 37 through 50 present an arc of a family that begins in Canaan. They're going to end up in Egypt. And the story of these narratives together shows how that happens and how a family develops over that time and how two members of that family in particular develop, and that's Joseph and Judah, brothers, sons of Jacob. And so I want you to think of these stories in that way. We're going to look at the story not as a whole. We'll once we finish, we'll be able to look back and see it as a whole. We're going to look at it in its component parts, and that's another feature of Bible narrative. Even though there is an arc that connects all of the episodes together in one central message, there are still individual episodes or chapters, if you want to call them that, mini stories within the larger story. And each of those episodes and each of those stories present to us lessons and messages and subpoints. We're especially going to see that tonight with chapter 37. There's a lot packed in to the 36 verses of chapter 37, and a lot of things that teach us. Some of the things are connected to the larger message that we're going to be building on, but some of the elements of this episode in particular are rather isolated to the story that we're going to look at. And so it is possible to come to a Bible narrative and pull out an episode like this and look at it individually. And so we'll be doing that each week as we move along the story. So I want you to remember those two components about Bible narrative. The second thing I want you to remember about these chapters in particular is, we often think of these chapters as being the story of Joseph. And I've been careful not to introduce it as the story of Joseph. It's the continuing story of Jacob. Jacob is still alive through these chapters. Although now, as we come to chapter 37, he kind of recedes into the background a bit. And it's going to be his sons, and not just a son. It's not just Joseph who's going to take center stage. It's going to be two sons. It's going to be Joseph and it's going to be Judah. And these two characters are often played off of one another. They present to us a contrast at first. But these set of episodes, although Joseph's going to really be the main character for a bit, they're as much about Judah as they are Joseph. And if you'll stick with me through this series over the next few weeks, you'll see that. We're going to see a transformation in Judah, not so much Joseph. Joseph remains fairly constant in the story. The intrigue really involves Judah and how Judah is becoming a different person. The importance of that for the larger story of the Bible is that it's going to be through Judah that God is working his promise. I'm talking about the promise that was originally given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, when he told Abraham to leave his homeland and his family, to go to a land that he would show him, and God says, I will bless you. I'm going to bless you with a family, first of all. Remember, Abraham had not had children to that point. He was 75 years old. But God is saying, I'm going to bless you with a child, and not just a child. I'm going to make you into a nation of people. And he says, through you, not only will your family be blessed, but all of the families of the world will be blessed. Well, you and I know the rest of the story. We know where all of this is leading. It ultimately leads to Jesus Christ. Well, it's going to be through Judah that promise is ultimately realized. Judah will be the promised son of Jacob, and it's going to be through his lineage that Jesus comes. As important as Joseph is going to be in the details that we're going to be looking at in these episodes that we're going to be looking at beginning with chapter 37, it's Judah that has the primary importance, because that is where God is working. Now, he's working through both of these sons, and that's another element that I want you to notice through this story, that God is going to be working both through Joseph, and that work is going to be more noticeable through Joseph at this point, because you remember Joseph, in effect, is going to be the savior of his people. But that is to really facilitate what God is going to do through Judah in the generations and centuries to come. Those two elements are connected together. God is going to bless this family through both of these sons, through both of these brothers. There's one more thought that I want you to keep in mind as we look at these stories, and this is one that really impacts what we're going to look at tonight as we go through chapter 37. And that is, we have a truth about God that's going to be reinforced in this series of narratives, and that is that God's choices are often different than our choices. And a lot of times God's choices are at odds with our choices. Or maybe a better way of saying it, our choices are different from what God's are. and our choices are at odds with what God's choices are. We're going to see some of that in this chapter tonight. So I want us to look at Genesis 37, and I'm just simply going to read through it and at times pause in the narrative. It's a very interesting story. I mentioned a moment ago that it's one of those stories that we've heard since the time we were little kids, and I would venture to say even somebody that doesn't have much of a Bible background or a church background knows this story or knows elements of this story. It's become that known in our culture. But I think sometimes we just relegate it to a children's Bible class and we don't think about it much as mature people. And that's what we're going to do. This story is geared toward as adults as much or more so than it is kids. But it teaches all of us at all ages. Genesis 37 begins by telling us that Jacob had settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, on the land of Canaan. And then it says this is the story of the family of Jacob. That verse connects us with where we left off a couple of weeks ago in chapter 35. Remember, chapter 36 that we looked at last week was the ancestry of Esau, his heritage, his family heritage. That kind of interrupted the flow of the story of Jacob. Well, this verse is meant to remind us, okay, this story is continuing from what we were told before, from chapter 35 all the way back to chapter 25, about Jacob's family. You remember, Jacob has now come back to the land of Canaan after spending 20 plus years living in that foreign land where he found his wives, where he was living with his mother's brother and his family. They have come back, and we talked about all the intrigue related to that return. Now we're introduced to Joseph. That's the verse 2 there, midpoint of verse 2. It mentions Joseph being 17 years old. Last time we had Joseph really mentioned it was at his birth. Remember, he was the 11th son of Jacob and the first son that Jacob had with Rachel. Remember, Rachel was the wife that he truly loved. I want you to remember that truth about Jacob, because that's going to fit into what's happening here. Because Jacob's love for Rachel is going to transfer to his love for Joseph. And I think really that is at a disadvantage to his other sons. And it's going to fuel some of the things that we see here. Well, notice now Joseph is 17 years old. So he's not quite a man. In our way of thinking, he would be just on the cusp of that. And in Jewish culture, he probably has a few more years to go to attain that type of status. But he is growing up here. We're told that he's out with his brothers and they're shepherding the flock. This isn't all of his brothers. The next phrase there says he was the helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. Remember, these were the concubines or the servants of Leah and Rachel, the wives of Jacob, who they gave to Jacob to continue their own providing of children. And we won't go back into that drama, but you probably remember the details. You can go back to chapter 29 and 30 and read them if you need to be refreshed. So he's out there working with the sons of these two, which would amount to four sons in total. It would be Dan and Gad and Naphtali and Asher. So we're not talking about all the 12 sons right here. We're just talking about those four plus Joseph. Well, notice what Joseph does. He brings a bad report of those four to his father. That's really our introduction to Joseph. You know, we don't like a snitch. You know, we often call a snitch a rat. Just imagine these four brothers and what they must have thought of Joseph, a younger brother at that, telling on them. So that's the beginning of this story of Joseph. There's some ill will. We're not told what his motivation was. Maybe he was very valid in the report he was bringing. We're not told what the brothers did, but it may have risen to the point of needing to be reported to the father. There's a lot of questions here. Why is that? Maybe it's Joseph and his lack of character, telling on his brothers. Could be that. Now we are going to see with Joseph. Joseph is a godly man. At least he grows into a godly man. One of the great paragons of virtue or faith in our Bible. The introduction, though, to Joseph is really the only negative point told about him. In this chapter, at least the beginning part of this chapter, he doesn't seem to be a brother that you could get along with very well. He's telling on his brothers. Later on, it's going to be pride that kind of fuels his motivation. Now, it's all rooted, I think, in what God is doing in the story. Although that might illustrate a sub-point here, that God often works through our weaknesses and through our foolishness to achieve things. We see that repeatedly in the Bible. I think we see some of that here in this chapter. Well, notice verse 3, we're then told about Jacob, or Israel as he is named here, his love for Joseph. This goes back to his love for Rachel. Remember, Rachel was his beloved wife, his first choice. Well, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other children. Now, in modern ways of thinking, this isn't a positive. You know, how many of us have seen favoritism in families and favoritism of a parent to a child? It can be a difficult thing, even a destructive factor in home life, and I think that's true with this family. It's one thing to have favor toward a child, a son or a daughter. It's quite another to be showing favoritism to a child, and that's what we're having here. He loved Joseph more than any of his children. The explanation is because he was the son of his old age. And a lot of that's the sentimentality of his love for Rachel, but also the fact that Joseph was born 11th in line. There is a younger son. You remember Benjamin will be the 12th son. And we assume Benjamin to have been born at this point. Notice how Jacob shows his love for Joseph. He makes him, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version, which says a long robe with sleeves. You probably know the description more as a multicolored coat. That's usually what we think of when we think of this coat or cloak or robe that Jacob made for his son Joseph. The actual wording in Hebrew is very difficult to translate. It's wording that isn't used very much at all anywhere else. And so we don't know if it's a multicolored coat or maybe the long-sleeved coat that the New Revised calls it. I think the NIV uses the same terminology, a long-sleeved coat. I think probably the better understanding is that it's a coat of some ornate fashion. It's not ordinary, in other words. It may have been made up of different colored threads. That may be what it is. At the very basis of it, it's not a coat that you would usually wear. It's something special. In this day and time, people wouldn't have had a whole wardrobe of clothing. They would have had 2 or 3 articles of clothing that they would have worn, even the wealthy. And they would have worn things that were kind of utilitarian. In other words, they could get out and work in them. They could get their hands dirty in them. Whatever this coat is, whether it's long-sleeved or multicolored or ornate in design, it probably wasn't a workman's coat. In fact, one description I saw of it is that it was kind of a princely gift. It was meant to distinguish Joseph from his brothers and from anyone else. Which, as we get into the story a little bit more, we're going to see maybe that's what's going on here. Jacob is meaning to distinguish Joseph from the others. And think about it for just a moment. Think about the brothers. They're out there tending sheep and working a hard job, and here comes Joseph in this ornate coat. almost coming out to be their foreman, their boss. That's what's going to happen when we get down to verse 12. And the brothers aren't going to react very positively toward that. In fact, they're going to act with a great deal of resentment. Yeah. One thing I see here is a family that's rather dysfunctional. We see a father that's fueling that dysfunction for whatever reason. You know, his love for Rachel, I'm sure, was legitimate, and the love that he had for the children of Rachel was certainly legitimate. And it's hard to challenge that, but he has a larger family here, and I think he has a responsibility to his other sons to be more noble in the love that he shows. And I truly think one of the things we're to see in this story is that the resentment that the other brothers are going to have, and it is resentment, it's a resentment that really boils into hatred. And they do harm to Joseph. We're going to see that by the end of this chapter. I don't want to dismiss their actions, because certainly they made their own choices. And we'll talk about those in a minute. But we know our own behavior often has some underlying motivations and influences. I think we're seeing that with this family. You know, human nature really hasn't changed a whole lot in 2,000, actually nearly 4,000 years now, since this time period. Human nature's been pretty constant throughout time. We're seeing that here. We're seeing a family that's dysfunctional, and there's some reasons for that. And part of that, I think, is the foolishness of Jacob and the favoritism he showed. But if you go back a little bit further, we're going to see that that's a generational thing in this family. Think about how Jacob was raised. Jacob was raised in an environment of favoritism. Remember Jacob and Esau, the twin brothers, the sons of Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac, you remember, showed favoritism toward Esau. That was the son he loved. Rebekah had love for Jacob. Now, we talked about all of that intrigue as we were talking about that family, and how a lot of that may have been fueled by what Rebekah had been told when the two sons were still in her womb. And there was conflict there. You remember God spoke to her and essentially told her that Jacob would be the favored one, the younger one would be the favored one. And I think Rebekah used that to fuel her favoritism, not only for Jacob, but then you remember she kind of masterminds the trickery that went on with Jacob obtaining the blessing from Isaac, tricking him into thinking that he was blessing Esau when he was blessing Jacob. Remember, Rebekah had her hands in that. And we saw how that really served to fragment a family. That family was essentially separated from that point on until Jacob and Esau are able to bury the hatchet and they make up. But it caused a lot of angst in that family. You know, just looking at this kind of philosophically or psychologically, maybe a better term, you wonder if Jacob picked up some of his tendencies from his parents. When we think about human nature, that happens with us if we're not careful, isn't it? You know, we're influenced in many good ways by our families of origin, in many ways that we can applaud and uphold. But there's a lot of baggage in our families at times that we need to be careful about, and we can begin to make choices to avoid and to move past. Sometimes that's an easy thing to do. Sometimes it's a very difficult thing to do. Well, here we're seeing some generational dysfunction. There's a pattern of behavior from one generation to another, and then perhaps to another. In fact, there's kind of an interesting episode at the end of Genesis where Joseph, now as an older man and a family of his own, brings his two sons to Jacob before Jacob's death, and Jacob is going to bless them. And maybe you remember the scene where he actually puts his right hand on the younger of the sons, which is Ephraim, and his left hand on the older of Joseph's sons, which was Manasseh. That was a sign essentially of giving the favored blessing to the younger son, Ephraim. And Joseph tries to correct his father from doing that. And Jacob says, no, this is the way things will be. So maybe we see that same dysfunction going to another generation. It's kind of an interesting thing to look at and to consider. We know what happens here, though. We know, and Exodus, before we get there, I want you to go to Exodus. Exodus chapter 21. There's an interesting thing that God says that might be commentary on what we're seeing here with Jacob and his sons. This is Exodus chapter 21, verse 10. This is spoken through Moses several hundred years after the time of Jacob and his sons. But when I read this, I want you to think, is this God actually offering commentary to help correct what went on in this earlier family? Notice Exodus 21 verse 10 says, if he, a man, takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish the food, clothing, or marital rights of the first wife. And if he does not do these three things for her, she shall go without debt, without payment of money. It's describing a man who marries a second woman and gives the warning that that man needs to take care of the first wife, to not diminish her, to not shortchange her. Now think about Jacob. Jacob is a man that married Leah first. Now we know the story. Leah was not his choice. Rachel was his choice. He's tricked into marrying Leah. But the fact of the matter is he married Leah first. And then he married Rachel. And it's obvious from the narrative as it unfolds that he favored Rachel. He loved Rachel. He favored Rachel. And I imagine he was more particular with her family. And we certainly see that with Joseph than he was the children he had with Leah. And then the two concubines added in. So it's kind of curious, God saying this. It seems to fit with what's happening here. I think it's God warning his people, don't be like Jacob in this respect. Well, let's go back to Genesis 37 and let's continue going through what happens. Jacob presents this coat, this ornate coat, to his son Joseph. And the brothers have a problem with that. They're offended by that. Then we're told of some dreams that Joseph has. Verse 5 tells about one where he comes to his brothers. He says, listen to the dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. He's talking about, and in a way he's prophesying, because this is all going to work out to be true, where his sons will come and bow before him. We're going to see that happen when the brothers come to Egypt and deal with Joseph, who at that time had been made second to Pharaoh. You remember the details of how that happens. Well, here is a young Joseph. Remember, he's basically a teenager at this time, telling these things to his brothers. The second story is much like the second dream that he had. This time it involves the sun, the moon, and 11 stars. And he says they were all bowing down to me. It wasn't just the brothers now bowing. It's all of the brothers, including Benjamin. Notice he says 11 brothers. And the parents, the sun and moon, all bowing down. And at this point, not only are the brothers offended, Jacob's offended. And he chastises Joseph for this. In effect, what Joseph is doing is prophesying. Obviously, these dreams are from God. And Joseph is able to interpret dreams. We find that out here. And you remember that's going to be employed later on. He's going to interpret 4 other dreams. 2 dreams by servants of Pharaoh and then 2 dreams of Pharaoh himself. That starts here. So he's perceptive, and I think spiritually so. God has blessed him with this wisdom. But he comes across as very arrogant, doesn't he? All too eager to share this with his brothers. And I don't think we need to dismiss that here. There's some issues with pride. As good a man as Joseph is going to be, and he certainly becomes a good man, and he becomes somebody for us to look up to and learn from. I think there's something here to warn us, because I don't think the bitterness that his brothers had toward him, the resentment they had toward him, was all about just them. We can fuel that same type of resentment with our pride at times. We need to be careful with that. And I think there's a warning here for that to us. Well, the narrative continues, verse 12. This is sometime later. We don't know exactly how long. We're told the brothers had gone to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. At this point, I'm thinking it's all the 10 older brothers. I don't think Benjamin is included in this. Remember earlier it was the 4 brothers, Dan, Gad, Naphtali, and Asher. Now it's all of them. They're not all named. In fact, 2 of them will be named, Reuben and then Judah. But I think the implication is it's the group of them. Shechem, by the way, was about 80 miles from where Jacob and his family were living. So quite a ways, several days' journey for somebody walking in this time. But Jacob wants Joseph to go. And so Joseph goes. It's interesting, the only time Joseph speaks in the rest of this chapter is when he says, "Here I am," when he responds to Jacob's command for him to go to his brothers. I want you to remember that. The rest of this story, the way it's told here in chapter 37, Joseph is silent. Keep that in mind. After he says, "Here I am," he is silent. He just goes. He's the obedient son. And he goes, we're going to find out in a moment, he's wearing this ornate cloak. Again, whatever you think of this coat, it wasn't an ordinary working coat. It was the coat of a prince. Was he going to spy on his brothers? Is that what Jacob wanted? We're not told directly, but it seems like that might be. Jacob wants a report, and so he's going to send his spy. Well, that's how the brothers interpret it. He comes, verse 14, he comes to Shechem where they had been. He finds out that they've moved on to another place called Dothan. We think that was probably about another 10 to 15 miles further, another day's journey in essence. And so he goes, and we're told that they, verse 18, the brothers see him from a distance. So Joseph doesn't get up to them before they see him and they respond. And their response is not positive. They don't like him. There's resentment here. There's hatred here. That isn't just built on 1 or 2 episodes. That foments over time. For 17, 18, 19 years, however long Joseph has lived at this point, just imagine these brothers kind of living in his shadow when it came to their father's love. And these brothers now are all grown. They're all older than Joseph, maybe as much as 10 to 15 years older. If we're to go back to Genesis 29 and 30 and read how the family unfolded and how it grew. So these men are grown men now. Some of them with families of their own. We're going to find that out next week as we look at the next chapter. And so just imagine what they must have been thinking. They're out here doing the work, and now Joseph shows up in his special coat, and they're seething. And before he even gets to them, they've already plotted about what to do to him. There's a breaking point here. Now they're going to actually act out and harm him. And they're going to be not in one accord as to what to do. I think there was some thought, well, let's just kill him. That's the end of verse 18. It says they conspired to kill him. But then we find out that Reuben, verse 21, Reuben is the oldest son of Jacob. At this point, he's at least 30 years old, maybe a little bit older. Reuben doesn't want to kill him. He just says, well, let's put him in a pit here. We're told that the narrator explains that Reuben had the thought, well, I'm going to come back and rescue him when the others aren't looking. In a way, that seems noble of Reuben, but it really doesn't. Reuben should have been the one, as the oldest son, to stand up and do the right thing. Even if he didn't care much for Joseph, out of respect for his father, he should have done the right thing. Maybe you remember, we've already been told a little bit about Reuben. Reuben doesn't have much respect for his father. There was a brief mention in chapter 35 of how he had taken Bilhah, one of the concubines of Jacob, and had slept with her. Jacob later on, when you get to chapter 49, is going to condemn Reuben for that act. So there's already been somewhat of a falling out between Reuben and his father, and Reuben doesn't come across as the good person in this. Well, in this episode, he doesn't either. He doesn't do the right thing. He's trying to do a self-serving thing. I think in his thinking, well, I'll get Joseph and I'll bring him back to my father and I'll be the hero. He really wasn't the hero. He's trying to do so in a way that doesn't make him look bad to his brothers. Well, then notice what happens. They put him in this pit. When they did that, they took the robe off of him. That robe's going to come into play here in just a moment. Verse 25, it says they sat down to eat. The way that's worded, it basically is they're not really concerned about Joseph at all. They threw him in the hole. They've forgotten about him. But they look up and they see a caravan of Ishmaelites. They're also going to be described as Midianites. And it gets a little bit confusing as this two groups of people, because the Ishmaelites and Midianites were two groups of people. The Ishmaelites, of course, were descendants of Ishmael, one of the sons of Abraham, the eldest son of Abraham. The Midianites were actually descended from another son of Abraham, one of the sons that he had with Keturah, his last wife, his second wife, that he married after Sarah had died. So in essence, the Midianites and Ishmaelites, they're both related to the Israelites. They're all cousins and not many times removed. It makes you wonder if they knew some of these Midianite travelers or Ishmaelite travelers. We're not told that. We're just simply told that they see them. And then we have Judah. This is where Judah enters the picture. He says, verse 26, he says, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." This is the first time Judah speaks in the book of Genesis, and notice how he is characterized. He wants to profit off his brother's misery. That's what he wants. So that's our starting point with Judah. Remember I said earlier, Judah is going to be the son that God is ultimately going to work his promise through. To bless not just this family, but all the world, to bless you and I. That comes through Judah and his lineage. But right now, notice his character. He's an evil man at this point. He wants to just sell his brother and profit from it. He wasn't necessarily opposed to killing him. He said, why not let us benefit from it? And so the brothers agree, and they sell him to the Midianites or Ishmaelites, or probably a combination of the two. Notice the selling price. This is the end of verse 28. They sell him for 20 pieces of silver. Now think about that total. It reminds me of another total in our Bible, in the New Testament, Judas. By the way, the name Judas is actually the name Judah. It's the same name in Hebrew. You remember what Judas or Judah does. He betrays Jesus into the hands of the priest for 30 pieces of silver. just a little bit more than this. This is 20 pieces of silver, but I think the difference is negligible. It's meant to remind us. Actually, Judas's action in the New Testament is meant to remind us of this. Here we have brothers selling their brother for 20 pieces of silver. Here you have in the New Testament Judas selling Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. So we have that connection. There's some other issues that happen with this. You remember the brothers are then going to cover up what happened by taking the cloak. Remember that ornate coat, that special gift that Jacob had given his son. And they're going to dip it in goat's blood. Rip it and make it look like that an animal had attacked Joseph. And that's going to be the story that they bring back to Jacob. And you remember that story is going to devastate Jacob. He then thinks his son is gone. He's dead. An animal killed him. And Jacob's the one that mentions that. And the brothers don't deny it. That's what they wanted him to believe. Now that's interesting. I want you to think about Jacob for just a minute. Many years earlier, Jacob is going to put on the garment of his brother Esau. And he's going to go into the tent where Isaac was with a meal. You remember what that meal consisted of? A goat, a kid, that his mother Rebekah had prepared for him to bring into Isaac, to trick Isaac into giving him the blessing. You see the parallel here? Now his sons are going to take a garment of their brother, dipped in goat's blood, and trick their father with it. And we talked a moment ago about generational dysfunction. We're seeing that here. There's another element of this story, and this will be the final thing before we conclude. I told you earlier that Joseph speaks way back in verse 13 when Jacob says, "Go to your brothers." Joseph says, "Here I am." He is then silent through the rest of this chapter, through this narrative. That's important because in some ways Joseph is going to represent Jesus in this. We've already seen the one parallel with Judas selling for 20 pieces of silver, Judas selling Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Well, think about the parallel here. Here you have Joseph, silent. He doesn't give a word of protest. Now, what's interesting, if you go to Genesis 42, turn over there for just a moment. Genesis chapter 42. The brothers are going to think back on what happens here in Genesis 37, and notice what they say. This is Genesis 42, verse 21. It would help if I got to the right chapter. It was in chapter 41. Chapter 42, verse 21. They said to one another, this is the brothers speaking when they got into Egypt. They said, "Alas, we are paying the penalty for what we did to our brother Joseph. We saw his anguish when he pleaded with us, but we would not listen. That is why this anguish has come upon us." So obviously, Joseph pled for his life. It's hard to imagine being thrown into a pit and then sold to some strangers and not putting up a fight. Joseph obviously did that. That would be what any of us would have done. But chapter 37 is written in a way the narrator wants us to think of Joseph as being innocent in this, which he was, and being silent. Go to Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7. There is something that's said about Jesus that is meant to be a parallel to what we're seeing here. And you probably already are ahead of me and know where I'm going. Isaiah 53, verse 7. This is one of those chapters in Isaiah that obviously is speaking about Jesus. This whole chapter has allusions to things that Jesus did and experienced. Isaiah 53 verse 7 says, He, speaking of the servant of God who is or will be Jesus, He was oppressed and He was afflicted, yet He did not open His mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is before its shearers is silent, so He did not open His mouth. You think to the trial of Jesus. What does Pilate say? He says, you're quiet, you're silent, you're not going to answer me? That's what that's talking about. Peter's going to pick up on those same words in 1 Peter chapter 2 and actually use it to talk about us and how we respond in those moments. We need to be like Jesus. But it's also connected with Joseph. Remember, Joseph in a way represents Jesus. Joseph is going to come and he's going to save his brothers. God is going to bring them salvation through Joseph. Well, we see a connection here. He's sold by his brothers, much in the same way Judas is going to sell out Jesus. But then Joseph is silent through all of that persecution. Jesus will be silent in the persecution that is given to him. To me, that's just one of the wonderful connections in our Bible, how these narratives of the Old Testament aren't just stories that happened to people 4,000, 3,000, 2,500 years ago. These are stories that still have life, that actually point us to Jesus. Maybe you remember this morning as we were talking about the resurrection, Jesus showing up there on the roadside to Emmaus and talking to the two men that had left because they were so disillusioned about what had happened with the crucifixion. And all of the wild stories that had come out that morning about Jesus' body not being in the grave. They didn't know what to make of it. Jesus, starting with the law. This is the law here, Genesis. It's the Torah, the books of Moses. And then proceeding through the prophets and the writings, he begins to tell them about Jesus. This is one of those episodes I imagine he talked about that points to Jesus and what is going to happen with Jesus. We're going to see that element through this series of stories in the book of Genesis. It's not just about Jacob and his sons. It's also about Jesus. So here we have one story, one chapter in our Bible, and there have been so many different tangents of it. It speaks to human behavior and relationships in our family, giving us warning about the favoritism maybe we show toward a child, the bitterness that we can allow to build up. There's another connection there. Think about Cain and Abel. The first story we have of family in our Bible is of Cain becoming angry and embittered and resentful toward his brother to the point that he murders him. Do we not have those same emotions happening here? With brothers allowing their resentment for their brother to lead to the point where they sell him out and stage his murder in a way, stage his killing. I said human behavior hadn't changed a whole lot. It hasn't. So that's one area of the story that we can learn from. But then we can also learn from its connections with Jesus. Powerful stuff. Next week, we're going to try to look at chapters 38 and 39. I want to look at them together because they actually show Judah first, and then Joseph. Remember, there are two main characters, Judah and Joseph, through all of these chapters. Well, those two chapters in particular, 38 and 39, are going to show these two brothers in a very contrasting way. Joseph being the brother of faith, Judah being the brother with a lot of problems in his life. But we're also going to see how Judah's character begins to change. Judah is going to be a changed man, starting with this next story. Remember, our impression of him in this story is that he was an evil man. He either wanted to kill his brother or to get profit from selling his brother. We're going to begin to see him change as a person in the next chapter. So read chapters 38 and 39. We know chapter 39 well. We tend to skip over chapter 38. But both of these chapters work together, and we need to consider them. I want to thank you for being with us tonight. We've had several people join us in all the different places that this is being broadcast to. I want to wish you a good week. We've got another week of isolation, at least one more, and I have a feeling it's going to develop into more, especially in our area of the country. We are, all the models are skyrocketing right now in Gallup. And then, of course, the reservation lands. And so I think we're in for a longer quarantine than maybe we've anticipated or want. But, of course, it's necessary, I think, for the public good and for the public well-being. But my prayer is that you stay safe and well. If you do need to reach out to me, please do. Again, I'll be at the church building every day this week for at least a couple hours in the afternoon if there's something that you need. Remember those on our prayer list. I'm not going to go over that list again. I've mentioned them today a couple of times. Be praying for them. If you need the list, let me know and I'll get that to you. If there's something you need, if you need errands run, if you need food items, paper goods, whatever it may be, let us know. There's enough of us willing to get out and make those runs so that you don't have to. Let me offer us a prayer and then we will be done. Father, thank you again for today, and thank you for your word. May we ever be eager to grow in it. Father, I ask that you be with all those that have listened in tonight, that you would keep them safe and well, that you be with their families, that you be with each of us, be with our communities. Father, we love you and we thank you. In Jesus we pray. Amen. I'm going to play a song. If you want to listen to it, you can. If not, have a good evening.